Hello, fellow foodies. Welcome back to the show. I'm Dr. Cassandra Quave, your host of Foodie Pharmacology, the science podcast for the food curious. Now, I've spent years studying the biological activities of the Brazilian pepper tree because of its interesting antimicrobial properties. And so, when I came across this really interesting recent publication on a sister species known as the Peruvian pepper tree, it immediately got my attention. So, the scientific name of this species is Shinus molle, and it's better known to many of you as the plant that yields those gorgeous pink peppercorns you may find at home in your spice cabinet. And while I do really love the taste of pink peppercorn, especially as a seasoning for meats and veggies in my kitchen, there's actually another more interesting and even ancient use of this plant that is really fascinating, and that is its use in making beer. And it's not just any beer, but one that has, in this case, a bit of a hallucinogenic twist because of the addition of another plant ingredient to the beer. And this is known as Willka in Peru. And the scientific name of this other plant is in the bean family or the Fabaceae family, and I'm probably going to butcher the name, but it's Anadenanthera columbrina. And so I'm just fascinated with this combination of this hallucinogenic bean with this pepper tree beer, and how do we get to this magical entheogen beverage? I have the perfect guest today to examine this fascinating brew with, Dr. Matthew Biwer. He is the lead author of a new paper entitled Hallucinogens, Alcohol, and Shifting Leadership Strategies in the Ancient Peruvian Andes. And this was recently published in the journal Antiquity. Dr. Biwer is an archaeologist who primarily works in the Andes of Peru and the U.S. Midwest. He's interested in a great many things revolving around humans in the past and the present, but in particular, how food represents culture and how we can use food to understand cultural interactions and change in the past. Matt earned his PhD from the University of California, Santa Barbara, and is currently a visiting assistant professor at Dickinson College. Most recently, his research has focused on colonialism, culture contact, human environment relationships, and the role of climate change in understanding past food production systems. So, thanks so much for coming on the show, Matt. It's great to meet you.
It's nice to meet you too, Cassie. Thanks for having me.
Yeah. So why don't we just jump straight in? I'm really fascinated with this combination of ingredients to create this incredible beer. Why don't you tell us a little bit about the place where this was used and kind of the time period that it may have been used in?
Yeah, sure. This research comes out of the site of Quilcapampa, which is located on the very arid coast of Peru, a little bit inland and kind of the coastal uplands. And this is a small site that's attributed to the Wari culture. The site is located in the Siwas Valley, so it's a valley that has received very little attention. So this is one of the first kind of intensive archaeological excavation projects in this area. So being in this very hyper-arid region, we were interested in a number of things, but for the project, primarily, what was Wari doing here? This very small site that's located on on the side of an ancient road. We're investigating what was Wari doing in this region. You know, how are they impacting local people's lives, and what can this tell us about expansion throughout the Andes?
Yeah. So how many was this on the span of hundreds of years ago or thousands of years ago? How far back are we talking?
Yeah, so this dates to what we call the Middle Horizon period in Peruvian prehistory. So this dates to about 8600 to 1000, so a 400-year period where we see the coalescence and expansion of the Wari Empire around 8600, and then persisting in various areas until about 81,000. So it's about 400 years or so prior to the Inca Empire. So this is the first empire or expansive kind of state in South America.
Wow, that's incredible. So, what do we know about this group of people, about the Wari? They were the first empire in this region. How wide was their empire? How broad was it? Do we know that?
Yes, the Barri is centered in the Valley of Ayacucho, which is a bit
Hmm.
north of Siwas. And at about AD 600, we see Wari expanding and creating little colonies, or their material culture, iconography, ceramic styles, things like that, begin to kind of expand outside of Ayacucho. We find it all the way in the north of Peru, in the Cajamarca region, down to the coast of Peru, in modern day cities like Lima. And then far to the south of Peru, near the Chilean border in the Moquegua Valley. So it spans much of modern day Peru, and is attributed, it's considered to be a highland empire, but we definitely see Wari people making their way down to the coast as well.
Interesting. And so, as an archaeologist that's interested in food, I'd imagine that remnants or evidence of food use going back that far in time has got to be challenging to find. So, what do you actually look for when you're at a dig site, when you're doing this kind of research?
As a paleoethnobotanist, I'm primarily looking for seed remains.
Hmm.
These are either going to be desiccated or dried out or carbonized, and that's how we find them generally in the archaeological record. I'm looking for macro remains, so these are seeds that we can see with our eyes, or maybe a low-powered stereoscopic microscope. I'm also interested in micro remains. So these are starch grains and phytoliths, or little silica bodies
Mm.
of plant remains that are microscopic, and we would find embedded in ceramics or stone tools or lithics, as well as in sediments. So there's both micro and macro forms of plant remains that are kind of available to us.
That's interesting. Well, and I know, like, as an ethnobotanist, I'm sure you think about both the historic uses of these plants in the context of how they're used presently. And again, I think, as I mentioned in the introduction, this Peruvian pepper tree is the source of, it's also grown, by the way, in California, even. This is a source of those pink peppercorns that we have in our fancy pepper grinders. It's not related to black pepper. It's a very different plant family. It's in the poison ivy family, actually, not your black pepper family. Um, but, I think most of the listeners wouldn't have imagined you could make a beer out of those peppercorns. So, can you tell us about the beer making or the beer brewing process with these peppercorns? And, have you ever tasted this? What is it like? Or have you seen it brewed before?
Yeah, I mean, it's a very interesting plant. You're completely right, and there's a long history of its use in the Andes, not just for beer, but it's planted alongside fields in Peru today,
Mhm.
and it is a kind of a mild insect repellent, among other things. Um, so I have brewed this beer before. Some experiments with a colleague of mine, Dr. Donna Nash, and we brewed some of this a number of years ago, just to kind of see what the process was like. So it, as a fruit or a drupe, so these kind of stony fruited
Mhm.
fruits, we collected a lot of them, and they have a very distinctive pepper flavor. And based on local informants in Moquegua, as well as reading some literature on other regions of Peru where molle chicha is still brewed today, we did both a batch of soaking the drupes. So we added them to water, and on the advice of the informants, we left them in there for about 5 days,
Mhm.
and then used that liquid. We removed the drupes, and then used that liquid. We let it ferment. We also tried a boiled batch as well, and I'm in the process of still figuring out how exactly the Wari would have brewed it. We do have these kind of characteristic misshapen sort of quality to the millions of molle troops that come out of the ground at Wari sites. And so I'm currently engaged in kind of figuring out what makes this characteristic. The seed changes from basically a very kind of spherical shape to very kind of lobed or pinched. So it's kind of like it's pressed together.
Interesting.
So maybe squeeze to extract some of those that sugary liquid to ferment then.
So is there enough sugar in the drupes to actually, to really fuel a fermentation process, or did they possibly add other ingredients, or is that even known?
We're still, there's a little bit of research kind of going in that direction of trying to figure out what the ingredients were. My understanding of it, based on the physical plant remains, is that it's very likely that they were mixing plants, not just with hallucinogens like Willka, but other kind of staples like maize, corn. That is a very common chicha that's made today. And more direct to your question, molle, as I understand it, doesn't have a lot of fermentable sugars in it. There's a lot of kind of volatile oils in it, but relatively low sugar content. So it would make a mildly alcoholic beverage, but I think that there's really good evidence in the archaeological record that there's a lot of co-occurrence between things like maize or peanuts or potatoes that could be made into chicha as well. So it's likely that they were mixing the ingredients to make a more potent chicha.
And can you define for the listeners what is chicha as we know it today?
Yeah, chicha is kind of a catch-all term in Latin America, especially in South America today, for a fermented alcoholic beverage. You might see in a market a chicha de maíz, chicha de jora. So these are chichas made out of corn. But you could see a number of other things, such as it made out of peanuts or cassava or any other fruits or kind of things with fermentable sugars in them.
That's great. Okay, so we have this fermented product, possibly that was mixed with other sources of sugar, like potatoes or possibly maize, to get that fermentation going. I know that, well, at least when it comes to the Brazilian peppertree, these have a very, spicy, kind of peppery, like, flavor, and also with molle. So does the beer maintain those kind of volatile, very piquant qualities to the flavor?
Yeah, our batch that we brewed, it definitely had a fairly potent pepper flavor to it. And there's actually a brewery in Chicago that, in collaboration with the Chicago Field Museum and Dr. Ryan Williams, who'd been working in Moquegua on Wari and some of this brewing stuff as well, they did a collaboration, molle, and they added molle to kind of a more modern kind of Euro-American style beer, and it also kind of maintained those peppery qualities. So I would describe it as mildly alcoholic, like ethanol kind of flavor with a strong pepper.
Strong pepper face. Okay,
Yeah.
maybe something that like hot sauce lovers would enjoy.
Yeah, maybe. Yeah.
My husband would probably love it. He loves hot sauce. All right, so we've got this interesting brew with this plant, and again, for the listeners, this is a beautiful, I have brilliant red little fruits, little drupes that are in clusters on this plant, and you're making this peppery beverage. But then in your study, you also get into evidence around another plant from a completely unrelated family, from the bean family, the Fabaceae. And this is a plant that another ethnobotanist had explored before. He's actually my academic great-grandfather, if you go up the academic tree, Richard Evan Schultes.
Okay,
And
yeah.
yeah, and so Schultes back in the day, I mean, this is a guy who was a Harvard professor who took off for the Amazon and like was there almost like, I don't know, like 13 years before he came back home.
Sure.
And he was fascinated with the study of, especially of entheogenic and or hallucinogenic snuffs and other products that people would take to kind of achieve this state of a psychedelic state. And so one of the plants he talked about was, or he wrote about, was Willka, but as a snuff that would have been snorted into the nose, because we know today it's rich in some dimethyltryptamine containing compounds, which, if for any of the listeners that have tuned in before on our ayahuasca episode, we talked about the consumption, the internal consumption of plant materials containing DMT actually doesn't work very well unless you have these monoamine oxidase inhibitors also present, because it rapidly degrades in the gut. So here we have a snuff plant, not really a beverage ingredient, that has this DMT-like quality. First, what can you tell us about which compound is the most prevalent in the plant, and what did you learn from your evidence about possible combinations?
Well, so based on some of my background research in the area around traditional uses of Willka, definitely used as a snuff. And as I understand it, we have mainly DMT with some amounts of bufotenine to kind of give this kind of hallucinogenic effect that would be mainly taken as a snuff, as you mentioned. When it's taken orally, that those hallucinogenic effects are actually weakened by the stomach acids. But as part of, it's been hypothesized by others that it is possible to add Willka to an alcoholic beverage, that those beta carbolines that would be present as a part of fermentation would actually suppress the enzymes that would deanimate the DMT and bufotenine. And so you would actually have maybe not as sharp of a kind of hallucinogenic experience, but it would be kind of more prolonged and kind of more kind of drawn out and mellow, as I understand it.
Interesting. So maybe not as potent, for example, as you would experience with ayahuasca, which can last and is very intense, can last for hours, but something that has a weaker. So you're basically getting a little bit more effect out of the dimethyltryptamine, but not to the level that you might with other plant combinations.
That's kind of what we're thinking right now. But it's not common, as far as I understand, to add Willka to a beer. I haven't found any ethnographic or historical sources really kind of diving into that a lot. But theoretically, this would be an option for people.
Interesting. And so how did you come to, what was the evidence like as you're doing this work at the dig site? You're bringing samples back to your lab, looking at things under the microscope. Can you walk us through that process? Like how does this whole art of archaeology work? Because it's fascinating that you're able to pull together the, to understand how these things work.
Sure. So really briefly, archaeology 101, we're very interested in the stratigraphic layers of these soils. And so these would be both natural in kind of a road cut. You would see, kind of the cake pieces, layers along a road cut. We have the same kind of things at archaeological sites, these kind of cultural sediments that are the product of human activities. And so archaeology is nothing if the very meticulous removal of these sediments and everything we find in them. And as a paleobotanist, I am, while excavating, looking for all the other artifacts, I'm taking systematic soil samples of the different areas of archaeological sites. And we haul these bags of soil back to the lab, and under a microscope, I am sifting through them, looking for these seeds. And so as I'm looking through them, I'm counting them, I'm weighing them, I'm organizing them, and I can't tell you how many. I probably could quantify it if I took some time, but it's in the millions of these little seeds that one by one I'm picking out of the soil.
Takes a lot of patience and skill, I'm
Yeah,
sure.
and that's basically how I spent a large part of the last 14 years.
It's picking out tiny
Yes.
seeds. I mean, that's great. Well, it's knowing what to look for too. I mean, I think that's the challenge is understanding the differentiation between different types of seeds. I mean, I was trained in botany, but never in anything at that level of looking at, old samples of plant fragments and remnants. I had the luxury of fresh plants that had beautiful big flowers or fruits that I could like cut apart and determine, what was going on.
Yeah,
Um,
I mean, I think it's interesting that we have kind of two different takes on like a very similar thing, because as a part of the archaeological record, these plants actually go through a whole slew of taphonomic processes. So after
mhm.
they're deposited, there's wind, there's rain, there's compression from soils, there's age, there's bacteria, and all these things that impact what these plants, the seeds, and other parts, what they look like. And so I know what to look for in terms of what a carbonized maize kernel or a peanut or a carbonized bean looks like. But these things oftentimes look very different than modern examples of it. So sometimes I would recognize a modern seed, but sometimes I wouldn't. And I think it would go for the same for you. If I showed you a carbonized, example of something, it might look kind of strange. So maybe together we make a really good team.
Yeah, there you go. The modern and the ancient together. I love that. Well, we know like maize has changed a lot. I mean, over human influence, over the centuries, in size. It's amazing how humans have worked with their resources to not only develop these interesting foods, but also to, select for certain crops and certain crop features over time.
Mhm.
Um, was there I don't know if you can tell if there's a way to understand this from based on the archaeological evidence, but is there any evidence that Shyness molle would have been cultivated, or it just kind of grew wild, or how is it grown today? Do locals, I know you mentioned they plant it sometimes. Is it kind of as a hedgerow?
Yeah, so it is it's native to the Andes, Shyness molle.
Hmm.
And it would be growing wild, maybe not as plentiful as it would have been in Siwas today. It's very
Hmm.
dry there, even for a drought tolerant tree like molle.
Mm.
But in general, it would be wild, growing fairly well in the Andes. My Based on the paleoethnobotanical remains, and actually this is a very interesting kind of empirical sort of thing. Where we find Wari sites in the south central Peruvian Andes, we actually sometimes find a lot of standing groves of molle.
Oh,
And so
interesting.
a pet project of mine one day might be looking at
Yeah.
kind of what is there any kind of genetic continuity between the two in ancient and modern population. But my so these wouldn't be something like domesticated like corn, but
Yeah.
definitely tended. I think that as Wari as an empire kind of spreads, and this idea of kind of like maybe ecological colonialism, they're encouraging the molle tree to they're intentionally propagating it. They're keeping stands, and there's even some scholars that have suggested that this would have been kind of part of a labor system that locals would have been paid, or some kind of reciprocal exchange actually would have occurred between Wari and locals to kind of help Wari cultivate food as well as these molle. They're great for firewood as well as for the drupes.
That's fascinating. Well, I mean, as I mentioned earlier, my fascination with shyness, with the genus, has been more folia and from Brazil, which is now an invasive species in the U.S. and Florida. Um, but my fascination has been all about the anti-infective properties, and I can tell you, we have found some amazing, triterpenoids from the fruits of the plant because going back to historic records, from when you had these early naturalists from Europe that were exploring the region. There's evidence that these were being used topically as medicines for wounds. And then the leaves also had other kind of anti-infective properties. And we've been studying the chemistry and biological properties of both of those aspects in the lab. But, I haven't looked at molle, and I'm wondering, from current uses, are there other uses today or maybe in the historic record of such uses of molle in Peru beyond its food applications?
I have read a few different studies ethnobotanical studies that have looked at molle as a treatment for stomach ulcers and things like that. So I definitely I think that either making a tea out of the leaves or the drupes themselves and not fermenting them definitely could have some kind of antimicrobial property. So beyond that, I know that you can make a dye out of the bark.
Oh,
Um,
interesting.
and then it is just very interesting and kind of anecdote when we were making our chicha years ago. We also made a batch of corn chicha, and without prompting, our local informants told us that so we would soak the chicha, the corn kernels, and get them to sprout in order to kind of get those sugars going so that we could grind them and ferment them.
Hmm.
Well, they told us after we had soaked them and they began to germinate that we should lay them in a bed of molle leaves and then wrap them up.
Oh,
And all kinds of lights started going off because, as you mentioned, these are kind of antimicrobial, and kind of antiseptic properties. So that would help keep mold and things out as we continually wetted it for about a week to kind of increase that germination,
oh
which
my gosh.
is
I
just incredible to think of.
I have light bulbs going off in my head right now. I'm so excited to hear that because one
Yeah,
of my graduate students, Luis Marquez, is actually working on leaves of the other species of Chinese terebinthifolia, and has found some really potent antifungal compounds,
yeah.
like really potent. And so that would definitely fall in line with that. I'll have to like get him to dig into more of the stuff on molle and the history. It's fascinating.
If I can add just one more thing, when we were excavating Quilcapampa, the site where the article is focused on, so imagine there's a room and we're excavating it, and there's a burned layer. So there's kind of ash, normal deposit soil, and then on the very topmost layer is a layer of burned ash full of local grass, somewhat higher up in the Andes, called ichu, stipa ichu. And it's been known ethnographically and historically and archaeologically to have been used for roof thatch for thousands of years.
Oh wow.
Well, we found a lot of ichu that was burned and very well preserved, but intermixed in the ichu roof thatch, you can probably guess where I'm going with this. It was molle leaves.
Whoa.
And
Wow.
so systematically, you have to replace your ichu roof thatch because you would get bugs and it would start to
Mhm.
rot and everything. And when I found the molle leaves in there that were very, very well preserved, I'm also looking at this thinking that there's so many different uses for molle, so it only kind of makes more, it adds to kind of the sense of why they would be focusing on molle, and probably encouraging its production is so useful.
Yeah. No, that's fascinating. I mean, here we have a plant that has, well, potential antimicrobial properties.
Mhm.
Um, if it's anything like its sister species of Terebinthifolia, it has some pretty good, antifungal properties. And at the same time, you have these utilities of the fruits in beverages, in medicine. It's a genus that just keeps on giving. I love this genus. It's like we keep digging deeper and deeper and keep finding new and interesting chemistries as well. And I think it's just a testament to here we have how many thousands of years ago did the warrior live again? That this was how many years back are we talking here?
This was about AD 600 to 1000. So 1000 to like 1400 years or so.
Yeah, so a million millennium ago, we had people using this.
Long time
And
ago.
and and this is, I think, what's also fascinating because, you know, out of all the species we have on Earth, there's a good number that humans have figured out how to use as food, as medicine, in textiles and construction. But yet we really haven't, systematically, really rigorously evaluated many of these to understand the full context of their historic use, their chemical properties, their other kind of potential utilities. So this kind of story gets me excited because it's another reminder there's a lot out there still for us to explore.
For sure. And I think that archaeology and ethnobotany and kind of the connections we can draw, we're finding out new things of, useful plants as well as, just different ways of producing plants in the past that are more sustainable than what we're doing today.
Yeah, absolutely. Absolutely. Don't get me started on monocultures on this episode. Okay. So
We can talk about that another time.
exactly. So, I mean, one thing I'd like to expand upon is your research on these other kind of social behaviors around food. So, concepts of feasting, food, social connections. Where does this all come together? And what can you gather from the kind of research you do about these ancient traditions?
Yeah, I don't, I could talk about it, anthropologically, but I think that everyone, when I start talking about food and how it's meaningful to people, everyone gets that. It's one of those kind of few human universals that everyone has to eat.
Yeah.
And we all eat, but we do it in different ways and we eat different things. But at the core of it, food is so meaningful to people, and it connects not only individuals or groups, but it connects you to place and it connects you to the past and ancestors, and all these ideas are wrapped up in kind of an embodied material culture you physically consume. So it's so interesting. And as an archaeologist, and a paleobotanist, I'm really interested in how far we can kind of push these ideas of the social connections that food brings, to people, and push that back into the past, where it's very difficult. We have pottery, lithics, old food remains, littered about, 1,000-year-old sites. What can that tell us? Well, the patterning of it is really powerful in terms of helping us understand what people were doing with it.
Mhm.
And so that's kind of where we find food remains and where we don't find them, and what kinds of foods are there, and what other objects in those archaeological spaces we can begin to kind of reconstruct what people were doing with them, and in the same kind of idea how they were, at least how they may have been meaningful to people, and how these social kind of connections, the things that we're experiencing today with food and this power, it definitely extends into the past.
Yeah. No, absolutely. I mean, I think to understand where we're at today and where we're going in the future, it's key. It's so important to have that understanding of historic uses and practices. Well, I guess thinking about the future, where do you see this line of research going? Do you have additional projects planned around molle? Do you have, or on vilca, or on just these kind of hallucinogenic beverages? Is there something that you're working on now or planning to in the future?
Yeah, I'm interested in all things Andes, and especially
Hmm.
the food. And so right now I'm working with a colleague of mine, Dr. Beth Scafidi at UC Merced. She will be doing some stable isotope work on the archaeological Willka remains, so that we can do um, stable isotope analysis and source where this Wilca is from. So I have my suspicions based on kind of e- extant groves of Wilca in the Andes, where the likely closest sources were. But I'd like to know kind of in a region specific, so we can begin to draw out these kind of trade connections and movement of materials. Um, and as far as the moye, um, that's still an ongoing kind of research. We know that moye is very common in many sites of Wari, but we're still trying to understand what it, kind of its importance to wari. It seems to be emphasized as a beer making ingredients for feasting, and kind of wari seems to be have used feasting as a way to engage with locals and kind of create this political economy and hierarchy within its culture. And so I'm really interested in how this, what other ways we can look at molle in other sites, and kind of use it as a way to interpret wari colonialism. And so also with the Willka and molle, this is the first time we found Willka in a wari kind of habitation site where people were living.
Interesting.
So it's been found in burial contexts in other cultures, like specifically Tiwanaku, who is they were coeval with wari around the same time, but they're a highland group from Bolivia. We find snuff tablets in burials and in archaeological sites. So they were using it as a snuff. We don't have snuff tablets and other associated paraphernalia for wari. So maybe finding more evidence of Willka either through residues or other kind of macrobotanical evidence to kind of piece together, was it used widespread in this way, being added to chicha for a hallucinogenic effect at these parties, or is there a more diverse way that it was used at other sites?
Yeah, that's interesting. Yeah, and I wonder about if it's not really been noted in current ethnographic record. Yeah, it makes you wonder, was this more of a restricted practice, or it just got lost? I mean, we know that plant traditions do get lost over time. It's a changing thing. Traditional knowledge is dynamic. But it's a really fascinating line of study. Now, of course, I have to ask you this question. Do you have advice for our listeners if they could make their own semi version of, not with the Willka, of course, we're not saying you should add DMT to your beer on the show, but let's say if you want to add, maybe if you want to make your beer have a little bit of that peppertree flavor. We have access, obviously, to pink peppercorns. Is there a way to could you just grind it up and add it to your beer to get a sense of what it might taste like? I mean, we're dealing with the dry drupes, not the fresh, but I don't know if you've done any experiments with that yet.
I will be doing some experiments soon with dried molle, and kind of altering it. I'm not advocating anyone do add any plants to food and consume it without knowing what they're doing first. But if you're sure you have molle, I think that steeping it, you could make. I would envision it maybe working. I'm a brewer myself in kind of like a Euro-American kind of tradition. And I would envision it working kind of well steeped at the very end of a brew with maybe like a saison or some kind of farmhouse style where you have some of these funky flavors, and then you also could add some pepper. I wouldn't add it to the boil for very long, just because molle can, if you get too much of it, I think it would maybe add kind of an acrid flavor.
Yeah.
Beer. So maybe thinking about it as like a dry hop, and then it'd be a dry, kind of like a dry molle addition.
Dry molle, yeah. And again, molle is sold as pink peppercorns in the U.S., so don't go out and collect your own pepper tree if you're unsure. And again, there are different species of pepper tree that exist in the U.S., so yeah, don't go out and forage things that you don't know how to identify. But you can get the pink peppercorn at your spice rack to try out.
Don't email me saying, "Hey, I made this and it tastes horrible." Yeah. It's an acquired taste for sure, but
very unique.
You can get chicha de molle in Ayacucho today. So
nice. So in addition to the chicha de molle, do you have any other interesting or favorite recipes that you like to have for dinner while you're there for field work?
Peru is such a diverse country, and its food is just amazing as well. And I'm a foodie at heart, and so that's why I was really excited to be on the podcast. And my opinion, my humble opinion, you can't find better ceviche in the world than Peruvian ceviche.
Yeah.
So ceviche has to be probably at the top of my list. But there are other kind of more you might consider to be more like humble things, like arroz con pollo. It's a very basic kind of rice and vegetable dish with oven cooked chicken on top of it, and it's simple and it's a daily food, but I love it. There are other foods. If you're ever able to go to a Peruvian restaurant, a dish that's really popular in Peru is called lomo saltado, and this is beef that has been kind of cooked in with onions and tomatoes, and then it's served over French fries.
Ooh,
And
that does sound good.
That's a very tasty. It's a very tasty food. And the last thing I'll say is a Peruvian dessert cookie is called alfajores, and this is one of my favorites. It's two thin cookies, kind of something like a shortbread, and in the middle of it, sandwiched between the two cookies, is what's called manjar. And manjar is, I think it's like a dulce de leche, kind of like pasty, kind of brown, viscous, kind of not paste, but what is it?
Like a cream, or
yeah, like a thick kind of cream, dulce de leche, and it's just amazing. So if you're ever in Peru, you have to get an alfajor.
Yeah, well, and I can't agree more also on the potatoes, because as hopefully most of the listeners know, that's where potatoes originate, is in the Andes, and no better place than there to have some French fries. Awesome.
Oh yeah.
Well, here's to all the listeners. I hope you enjoy a nice brew with some nice Andean potatoes. And thank you, Matt, so much for coming on the show. Your work is fascinating. I just, like I said, when I saw that work, I was like, ooh, shyness, peppertree, beer, hallucinogens, we have to get them on. So I really appreciate you coming on the show.
Salud.
You've been listening to Foodie Pharmacology, the science podcast for the food curious, recorded online. You can find this and all of our other episodes on the Foodie Pharmacology website. You can also head over to our Teach Ethnobotany YouTube channel, where you can find the video version of this episode. And we also have some nice images from the archaeological dig site on that video. And you can stream this podcast on any of your favorite podcast streaming services. So be sure to hit that subscribe button, and do me a big favor, head over to Apple Podcasts, and please leave us a review. Jot down a little comment. Let me know how much you love the show. This really helps us in getting the word out to new listeners. Thank you so much for listening. I want to also thank our producers, to Rob Cohen and Christine Roth, for their excellent work in getting this beautiful show out to you all. And I wish you all a wonderful week of good health. That's it for now. I'll see you next time.